What if the people smiling at your boardroom table are your greatest threats, while the competitors plotting against you are the exact instruments required to scale your mandate? People say that this book is evil, but does the teachings in 48 Laws of Power actually align with scriptural precedents?
In senior management, we are conditioned to hire for cultural fit and loyalty. We want to surround ourselves with friends. We believe that familiarity breeds trust. Yet Robert Greene's second law exposes a massive risk that can destroy an organization from the inside out. This controversial book advises us to be cautious with friends. In church, however, we are warned to only associate with like-minded people. We are taught to disassociate with those that have opposing perspectives, but the best-selling book suggests that we should keep our enemies close. Well, what does the Bible specifically say? Does it contain evidence to justify this law? Is it scripturally proper to follow some of the teachings in this book? Did Christ himself use law number 2 to advance the kingdom of heaven? Let's examine the scripture.
Law number 2. Never put too much trust in friends. Learn to use enemies. Friends are dangerous. They are quick to agree with you to avoid conflict, which blinds you to your own weaknesses. Worse, the closer they are to your power, the more prone they are to envy. When you elevate a friend, they believe they inherently deserve it. An enemy given a second chance, however, has everything to prove. Therefore, they will serve more diligently.
Did God, the ultimate CEO, experience a failure in HR when he brought Judas into his inner circle? Before finalizing his executive board, Christ spent an entire night alone in prayer. The selection of Judas could not be a coincidence. It was a highly calculated strategic appointment. He knowingly placed a traitor at the table. Judas was not an outcast or a marginalized player. He was empowered with the exact same authority as the rest of the apostles, the power to cast out devils, and he was even explicitly trusted with the organization's treasury. But familiarity can breed a dangerous kind of entitlement, and eventually resentment.
Judas began showing signs of systemic misalignment long before the final betrayal. When expensive perfume was poured out on Christ, Judas openly criticized the expenditure under the guise of charity, forcing Christ to publicly correct his insubordination.
But Christ was not surprised by the betrayal. He knew the hostile takeover would originate from within his own ranks. He stated openly that he accepted the path, declaring in Matthew 26:24 that the Son of Man would go exactly as it was decreed. But he also issued a severe executive warning. Woe to the man used to facilitate that betrayal. Jesus did not rely on his friend's loyalty. He used the betrayal of a close associate as the catalyst to advance the kingdom's agenda. True sovereignty does not avoid the liability of friends. It factors their inevitable betrayal into the operational cost.
In the corporate world, this exact exposure plays out when senior management prioritizes brotherhood over boundaries. In the 1920s, Adolf and Rudolf Dassler built a footwear empire out of their mother's laundry room in Germany. They were blood brothers. They shared the same table, the same vision, and the same treasury, eventually getting their brand of shoes on Jesse Owens, the 1936 Olympics champion. But because they were family, the operational boundaries were non-existent. Their personal lives bled directly into the boardroom. As the company grew, the intimacy of their brotherhood devolved into deep-seated paranoia and toxic resentment. During World War II, Rudolf became convinced that his own brother betrayed him to the Allied forces to seize full control of the company. The fallout was explosive. The betrayal tore their family and their entire hometown apart, resulting in a bitter corporate divorce that birthed two warring companies, Adidas and Puma. Trusting a brother without the strict operational governance you would naturally apply to a rival creates a fatal vulnerability. An enemy can only attack your market share, but a friend can destroy your foundation.
Sometimes the critical voice of an enemy is necessary to reveal your hidden weaknesses. When the ultimate CEO looked at the brutal, ruthless empire of Nineveh, he did not send a compassionate, loving ally to minister to them. He deployed a deeply hostile asset. Jonah did not just dislike the Ninevites. He actively wanted their market wiped out. He hated them so much that he purchased a ticket in the exact opposite direction just to avoid helping them.
Yet God used his enemy-level hatred to deliver a raw, uncompromising message of destruction. A friendly prophet would have tried to soften the blow and negotiate. But Jonah walked into the city and delivered a 40-day eviction notice with zero empathy. It was so terrifyingly authentic and harsh that it triggered a massive nationwide repentance from the king down to the livestock. God did not change Jonah's hostile nature. He weaponized it. He used the uncompromising friction of an enemy to force a necessary market correction.
In corporate finance, this exact dynamic is executed through the activist investor. Wall Street views activist investors like Carl Icahn as hostile corporate raiders. They are the absolute enemies of the sitting board. When a legacy company becomes bloated, complacent, and paralyzed by friendly executives who refuse to make tough decisions, the company slowly bleeds toward bankruptcy. The friends on the board will watch the ship sink just to avoid a difficult conversation. But an activist investor buys up a massive stake and launches a hostile takeover. They do not care about the CEO's feelings. They do not care about the legacy culture. They ruthlessly fire underperforming management/wasted expenditures and force total restructuring. They do not do it out of friendship, they do it purely for profit. But it is exactly that unsentimental, aggressive hostility that ultimately saves the corporate ecosystem and restores value to the shareholders. An enemy will point out the fatal flaws that a friend is too polite to mention.
When you need to capture new market share and unify a fragmented territory, you do not always rely on your loyalists. You leverage your rivals' network. Consider David and Abner. Abner was not a minor opponent. They had a long, intimate history of conflict. When David killed Goliath, it was Abner standing directly next to Saul, advising the king on who this young warrior was. As the commanding general, Abner sat at Saul's right hand in battle, sharing and undoubtedly fueling the toxic jealousy that drove the king to hunt David. Their rivalry was deeply personal. When Saul hunted David in the wilderness, David publicly humiliated Abner, holding the very evidence of how close he got to the sleeping king. David loudly exposed Abner's absolute failure to protect the sovereign he was delegated to guard.
When King Saul finally died, it was Abner who immediately appointed Saul's son to the throne, deliberately creating the bitter operational rift that fractured the nation. Yet, when Abner offered to defect, David did not execute him for this lifetime of hostility. He did not let the emotions of their bitter past dictate his executive strategy. Instead, David threw a feast and formalized a strategic pact. David recognized a critical operational truth. Abner was the architect of the division, which meant he was the only man with enough influence to heal it. Abner possessed the exact relational equity required to unite all 12 tribes under David's banner. David used the political infrastructure of his fiercest enemy to unify his kingdom and secure the crown.
In modern commerce, this is the masterclass of supply chain strategy. Look at Apple and Samsung. On the consumer front, they are bitter, blood-feud rivals. They have spent over a decade locked in vicious billion-dollar lawsuits, fighting tooth and nail for global supremacy. But behind closed doors, the operational reality is entirely different. For years, Apple has relied heavily on Samsung's manufacturing infrastructure to produce the custom OLED screens, memory chips, and processors for the iPhone. The executives at Apple understood that to build a superior flagship product, they could not rely solely on friendly, smaller suppliers. They had to weaponize the manufacturing dominance of their absolute greatest enemy. Apple essentially pays its fiercest rival to build the exact hardware that keeps Apple on the throne. They use their enemy's supply chain to fund their own market dominance.
The highest level of operational dominance is not destroying your enemy, it is converting them. In its infancy, the early church was facing a massive, lethal regulatory threat orchestrated by one man, Saul of Tarsus. Saul was not a casual critic. He was trained directly by the Pharisees, the elite political and religious establishment of the day. As a top student and a fierce religious zealot, he was dogmatic in his strict observation of Jewish laws and firmly believed that the Christian movement was a blasphemous cult that had to be eradicated. He was relentless in his opposition. He did not just debate theology, he stood by and held the coats of the men who stoned Stephen to death. He secured official warrants and was willing to cross international borders, traveling all the way to Damascus in pursuit of fleeing Christians. He would violently drag men and women out of their homes, bind them in chains, throw them into prison, and actively vote for their execution, subjecting believers to severe physical punishment to force them to blaspheme.
But when the ultimate CEO confronted Saul on the road, he did not strike him dead. He executed a strategic conversion. Jesus repurposed the establishment's fiercest weapon into the chief global expansion officer of the early church. Saul became Paul. God did not change his aggressive, unrelenting nature. He exploited it. God used Paul's relentless drive to carry the message across foreign borders and to withstand the exact same physical punishments he once dealt out. As an apostle, Paul was beaten with rods, stoned and left for dead, repeatedly imprisoned and exiled. Yet he never wavered. He visited more territories than any other disciple, scaling the movement globally and eventually taking the message directly to the highest Roman authorities. Furthermore, Paul used his elite Jewish training to write more books than any other author in the New Testament. Because he knew the law so intimately, he was uniquely positioned to dismantle it, serving as the instrumental voice in correcting flawed theological practices that restricted or disenfranchised the Gentiles. The kingdom used the mind and endurance of its greatest persecutor to lay its permanent global foundation.
In the corporate sector, we see this exact conversion strategy utilized in high-stakes risk management. Frank Abagnale was the ultimate enemy of the global banking system. Before his 21st birthday, he had successfully forged millions of dollars in checks and breached the highest levels of institutional security across the globe. He was a relentless, hostile threat to the financial infrastructure. When the FBI finally caught him, they realized that putting him in a cell was a waste of a brilliant asset. They did not lock him away. Instead, they converted him. The banking industry's greatest threat was repurposed into their top security consultant. The FBI and major financial institutions realized that to build impenetrable banking systems, they needed the mind of the man who knew exactly how to break them. They weaponized his criminal intellect to secure their vaults.
The verdict on law number 2 is clear. Do not fear your opposition and do not be blinded by the comfort of your friends. If you are executing a divine mandate, you must learn to mitigate risk by converting the momentum of your rivals. The ultimate CEO will use the betrayal of your friends to push you to your purpose, and the infrastructure of your enemies to build your empire.
To test the remaining laws of power against biblical teaching, access the complete 48 Laws of Power playlist on your screen right now, and subscribe to Boardroom Bible, where we uncover real biblical principles needed to righteously navigate the ruthless world of business. I will see you in the next boardroom meeting.